Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, the author of Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. We spoke to her last year about her book on the Civil War-era West. That was called The Three-Cornered War. Dr. Nelson was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for that book. She's perhaps the friendliest person on Twitter. It's good to welcome you back to the show for our now annual tradition, Dr. Nelson.
Well, Evan, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Before we start the interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The only things I knew about Yellowstone National Park before I read this book is that it's beautiful in pictures and that it was a place off limits to the things that society markets to us every day. Stores, fast food, stadiums, cable news, none of that's there at Yellowstone. But who said this place should be protected from all of that and preserved for the people? Or at least some of the people, and we'll get to that. But Megan Kate Nelson's book explains how in the early 1870s, Yellowstone was saved, that is to say preserved, so we can see how it was back then. First of all, Doctor, you say Yellowstone was unattainable, that it was protected by its geography, even from the military. What did white men first learn about Yellowstone, and why did they become interested in it?
Well, the first rumors started to trickle out early in the 19th century. There was a man named John Coulter who had traveled with Lewis and Clark. And after he left that expedition, he wandered around the Rocky Mountains for a while, and he came out, barely surviving several interactions with the indigenous peoples in that region with these stories of mud pots and geysers, and no one believed him. In fact, they just nicknamed it Coulter's Hell and thought it was a kind of tall tale from a trapper or a trader. And of course, indigenous peoples had been in that region for thousands of years. They had stories to tell, but white Americans, when they got to that area, didn't believe them either. And it really wasn't until late 1860s, after the organization of Montana Territory, that white Americans really started to enter this basin. And it was really hard to get to. And the reason that the first groups were coming out of Montana is at that point, the only real access point was through what is now the northern entrance of Gardner, Montana, kind of where the Yellowstone River comes gushing out of the basin. There was no one knew about the entrance from the western side along the Madison. No one could figure out how to get over the Tetons to the south. And the Lakota peoples were defending their sovereignty in their lands to the east. So they were preventing any kind of exploration from coming in that direction. So it really was unknown to most white Americans up until 1871.
Were these tall tales they were hearing? What amazed them about what they were hearing about Yellowstone? And the name, by the way, came from?
Yes. So the name Yellowstone actually comes from the river, which is, given rise to in the mountains in a kind of the southern part of what we now know of as Yellowstone Park. And it comes out the northern side and then moves north and then east through Montana and then meets up with the Missouri River. And so it was Native peoples who first gave it the name Yellowstone because there were rocks that were being pushed all the way down that river valley. And they had some of the sulfuric elements in it, which had tinged them yellow. So the basin is actually named after just one of the rivers that is born there, the Yellowstone. The Lakota peoples called that river the Elk, though. So there were multiple names for that region.
So I asked about the tall tales, though. I asked like three questions.
Yes.
What did they hear? What amazed them, and were the stories true?
Well, so the trappers came out of there with these stories of thousands of boiling springs in all different colors, geysers shooting up hundreds of feet into the air. They were also reporting multiple towering waterfalls and huge canyons. And especially the geyser region, especially these geothermal elements, seemed insane to people. There had been some discoveries of features like this in Iceland and in Chile and New Zealand in the kind of mid 19th century, and there were hot springs in the East Coast in certain areas, in West Virginia, in parts of Arkansas, but it really just seemed crazy, these stories of so many thousands of these features that were throwing up water, they were throwing up mud, they were in all colors of the rainbow. And that just seemed incredible to anyone who had not been there.
2 million acres. In the 1860s, as you say, white people first started exploring it, or at least trying to explore it. And as I hinted, preserving it and exploring it meant at some point, at least for some people, taking it from the people who had been there. Would the indigenous people, as you said, have opened the front door if they'd just been asked nicely?
I don't think so. Not in this period. I mean, what's interesting about Yellowstone is that it was not claimed by any one particular indigenous nation. It was really a thoroughfare. Many indigenous groups, the Shoshone-Bannock, the Nez Perce, the Flathead, the Crow, and the Lakota to some extent, moved through Yellowstone in order to get to the Great Bison ranges of the Great Plains to hunt during that season. And they also hunted within Yellowstone and fished in Yellowstone. There were deer, there were elk, there were bison there also. So it really became a place, a kind of meeting ground, a kind of crossroads for a lot of different indigenous groups. And they were the stewards of that land. They took care of it. They monitored trespassers, including a lot of those early trappers who were coming in and out. During this period was a real escalation on the part of the federal government in trying to force indigenous peoples off of their homelands and onto reservations. And they had been successful in doing that in 1868 for several indigenous groups, creating the Wind River Reservation to the south, Fort Hall to the west, and the Crow Reservation on the north. And so but still Native peoples were still using the park to hunt, and were using it as a thoroughfare. So they were interested in protecting those land rights because they believed that they were theirs.
As in your previous book, The Three-Cornered War, you track the intersecting lives of main characters. So in this case, it's Jay Cook, Ferdinand Hayden, and Sitting Bull. If you can briefly introduce us to each, but I'm asking this as a setup to more of a writing technique question, is why is it so useful to weave together these lives as you try to tell a larger narrative?
Yeah, sure. So Ferdinand Hayden was a scientist explorer. He was born in poverty. He was a child of divorce, went to Oberlin College because his family did figure out that he was pretty smart and that he should probably get an education. And it was there that he figured out that he was pretty good at geology, and especially good and very interested in collecting fossils. And this was in the 1850s. He started pretty early in that period, going west. He liked to be out in the field collecting and really wanted to make a name for himself. He was very ambitious. He was very competitive. And at that time, scientists were kind of out on their own. There weren't any big scientific institutions. There were no real universities with huge science departments. And so, there were a couple, but they were not as widespread as they are today. And so scientists really made their money by collecting items and then selling them to other scientists and putting them in circulation and writing papers and getting hired, as Hayden did, to be the geologists or the scientists on major government surveys. So he started to do this. He had his eye on Yellowstone from the early 1860s, but didn't really plan to get there until he became quite alarmed that some amateur explorers from Montana had entered Yellowstone before he had. And so he cooked up this plan to lobby Congress for the money to go to Yellowstone in the spring of 1871. One of the interesting people who got involved in this was Jay Cook, who was an investment banker from Philadelphia. He was actually born in Ohio in Sandusky, but made his way to Philadelphia, was very good at numbers, started off as a clerk in a bank, and ultimately, on the eve of the Civil War, founded his own investment bank, became famous and extremely wealthy during the war, selling U.S. war bonds, made a huge fortune. And in the years after the war was really kind of craving the excitement and the kind of patriotic fervor of that effort. And he set his eyes on the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was meant to be the second transcontinental. It was called the Centennial Line. It was meant to be built by 1876 for the celebration of the nation's centennial. And he became really obsessed with this railroad project to the extent that he ignored everyone's advice, poured a bunch of his money into it, and actually loaned money from his own investment bank to the Northern Pacific, which he wanted to run right north of Yellowstone. And so he became very interested in Hayden's expedition. He sent Thomas Moran, a painter from Philadelphia, to go and join that expedition and to bring back images that he could use then in promoting the Northern Pacific. This all became a disaster for him, ultimately, in the book, partly due to Sitting Bull, who also emerged during the 1850s as a leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota. And he was really exerting his people's sovereignty rights, their land rights, in this vast territory that they held to the east of Yellowstone, between Yellowstone and the Missouri River. And he didn't have any run-ins with Hayden's expedition necessarily, but he had several run-ins with Jay Cook's Northern Pacific surveyors. And so I detail that story in the book and really see this moment as a time when Sitting Bull starts to really come to the attention of the federal government and to exert his own claims and his people's claims. And the fights that he had with the Northern Pacific in 72 and 73 actually, I think, led directly to the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876.
And weaving these stories together, lots of authors do this, but weaving the stories together for an author helps tell the larger story. How? What is it about the way you've all discovered the way lives intersect that history is made?
Well, I became drawn to writing about individuals for the Three-Cornered War because I really felt it's the best way for people to learn about what life was like on the ground. You know, you put your reader with people as they are moving through space and time, as they are taking action in certain ways, and you really become embedded with them almost. And, you know, people like reading about other people and their lives, right? I mean, it's great to talk about big ideas and it's great to talk about arguments and the significance of things. But when people are really drawn to books or to television or to movies, they're drawn to individuals and to the stories of those individuals. And so I have become interested in, and am continuing to write in this way, in that biographical mode, because I just think it's so interesting not only to dig into someone's life, but then to show that life to readers. And then what it exposes, which it did in the Three-Cornered War and it does again here, is all of these really interesting and unexpected connections between these people. I mean, Hayden knew Cook. Both of them knew of Sitting Bull. It's unclear whether he knew of either of them. I think he did in a general sense, but their paths cross pretty much constantly in surprising and interesting ways.
The subtitle of your book is Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. So let's get to that part of it. I want to read a quote from the book. Yellowstone was a site of contention and a perfect symbol of what the U.S. had become in 1871, a nation whose best idea required indigenous dispossession, which we've talked about, In this moment, the fragile crust of American democracy and political reunification barely contained the rolling, violent forces that lay beneath. So, you think about that quote in the context of Reconstruction America and what that stands for. So explain where America was in the 1870s as these rolling, violent forces were moving beneath the surface.
Sure. Yes. So this is a really fascinating period of time that I think we don't talk about enough in American culture or in our classes or in our books. And really what was happening in the late 1860s and early 1870s is the country was trying to come back together. Politically, bringing all of the former Confederate states back into the Union. The Grant administration, which came into the presidency in 1868 and stayed there until 76, was a Republican government, which at that point meant a more liberal sense of governing, a strong federal government that was working for the people. This is the party that passed the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And Grant was really invested in making sure not only that the Confederate States came back into the Union, but that the 4 million newly freed men and women not only had their civil rights, but had those civil rights protected. Because what happened is pretty much almost immediately after the war was over, white Southerners began to try to exert their power again across the South. And part of that effort was extremely violent actions taken against Black men and women across the South who were trying to exert their citizenship rights and their voting rights on a daily basis. So this is the period of the rise of the KKK. And I became really interested in how and why the federal government at this moment was, on the one hand, leading this fight against the KKK, launching investigations and actual trials against KKK members in the early 1870s, and funding Ferdinand Hayden's exploration of Yellowstone and then passing the Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world. And I really wanted to see, sort of like in the Three-Cornered War, I was thinking, well, what happens if we look at the Civil War from New Mexico? And here in Saving Yellowstone, my question is, what happens when we look at Reconstruction from the geyser basins and the huge waterfalls of Yellowstone? How do we get a different kind of picture of what is going on at this moment in history?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Why were Americans looking west for answers? We hear, we think about like these neat lines drawn between North and South, and there was this sort of simple little war that took place, and slavery ends because of it. Of course, it's not that simple. And what was it about the American West that had people who'd been kind of involved on the different sides of the Civil War looking out there and wondering what was out there?
Well, I think it's important to remember that what we know of now as the American West kind of came into the Union politically in the 1850s. It wasn't, it was only 20 years before this, right? And part of the federal government's job in dealing with these huge new land acquisitions was to survey them and to explore them, to kind of understand their nature and their natural resources and how they could be used. And this is really important. For the vast majority of our history, the American federal government has looked at land not as something to be enjoyed for its beauty, but something that could be converted into something else, right? You convert it into crops, you convert it into gold nuggets, you convert it into rangeland for cattle, right? You don't just sit there and look at it. that seemed to most white Americans as a complete waste, right? Whereas indigenous peoples saw the land as a natural resource also, hunting and fishing and growing crops also, but they also had sites of great spiritual meaning to them in the landscape. And this created a real conflict. This was sort of the basis of many of the conflicts in terms of land rights, because the federal government basically saw the entire West as what they termed public land, which could be taken up, surveyed, and then sold, either to corporations like railroads or to individuals who would then farm it or ranch it or mine it.
Was there this idea that the West could bring unity, that the answer to soothe the pain, the deep pain that had gone on between races and between regions, could find its salvation somewhere out there?
Yeah, there really was. And this is what is so interesting and ironic about how the West changes in the American imagination, because in the years before the war, the West brings on that national conflict, right? It brings on the war because the fight over whether slavery was going to extend into the Western territories is really what was driving the North and the South apart. Then there was a conflict for the West during the war, which I recount in the Three-Cornered War. And then during this Reconstruction period, there is a real sense among white Americans that the West was the future of the nation, that veterans of the war could go West and rejuvenate themselves, that the Homestead Act, which had been passed during the Civil War, would provide land for both Black and white farmers who had been loyal to the Union, and that then they could start to build a future in the West. And then there was this sense, and this had been present sort of from the 1830s onward, that America was, quote unquote, nature's nation, that America may not have these, the ancient ruins of civilization that Europe had, right? But what America had was Niagara Falls. It had the Rocky Mountains. And now it had this super weird geyser basin, and these amazing canyons and waterfalls of Yellowstone. And that it was nature that really exemplified America's exceptional qualities. And so Yellowstone is actually serving here. It is a place. It is a place to be surveyed and understood scientifically and bounded and mapped and preserved. But it is also, as in the quote that you read from the book, it's a metaphor for the nation too. And this is why I found it so interesting, because Yellowstone, the geyser basin part of Yellowstone is a profoundly weird landscape. It is extremely dangerous. It's very unsettling. It's volatile. People still are killed every year in Yellowstone, kind of wandering off the path and getting sucked down into the earth. I mean, this is not a place that is benign. And so it was, yeah, I was just saying that was partly what was interesting to me, that, instead of saving Niagara Falls or Yosemite or someplace in the Rocky Mountains as the nation's first national park, instead it was Yellowstone, which is, has this part of it, which is very typically sublime with its waterfalls and mountains, but then also very atypically sublime with these really threatening natural features.
I want to talk about the danger that exists, because something that you wrote about really reminded me sort of something that we just saw unfold over the last 6 months here in present day America. But before I do that, it occurs to me, is this idea of looking west during this time period an offspring of what we saw in the 1830s and 40s with what we call manifest destiny? Are they related?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you can draw the through line very starkly, that the West has always been in the American imagination, the white American imagination, this region of the future, a region of possibility, a region of reinvention, and all bound up in that is not only indigenous land possession, but also conquest, right? I mean, we gain all of that land through the Mexican-American War, partly through diplomacy, partly through purchase, but it is part of the nation's kind of imperial aims to take parts of the West and build the nation from coast to coast, from the Louisiana Purchase, early in the period onward, into, basically 1848, and then with the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, the national boundaries and the creation of the West is sort of complete from a territorial standpoint. But the effort to kind of understand the West and also to see it as the site of that manifest destiny that Providence has decreed, that white Americans will just explode in population and take over the country, and this is their fate and their destiny. And that is a very strong element of the American myth that drives a lot of the expansion, especially coming from east to west, which was only part of the story, but it was a very strong part of the story from the 1830s through really the 1880s.
So the danger of Yellowstone.
Yes.
You open the book with this scene of this horseman following his dog's sense. I hope I get this all right, but he was following his dog's sense that there was this guy. They found this guy basically together. The horseman, the dog, and the guy find another guy who'd been basically beaten to a pulp by Yellowstone. The missing persons case of Truman Everts. That is who it seems like that's who they found at that moment. So I can have you explain that missing persons case and why this captured the nation's attention. But as someone who covered the Gabby Petito case, she was found in a similar area under different circumstances. This was a murder and this was a different, kind of thing. But it just struck me that there was tremendous media attention around both of these cases, and that the mystery of this land and this geography was intertwined in the view that so many people had of what had happened, certainly to Gabby Petito and Truman Everts. I don't know if you made that connection before, but as I was thinking, I was like, wow, two missing people in this area that captured the nation's attention. But go reflect on that.
Right. Yeah, sure. So Truman Everts was along on one of those early Montana expeditions in 1870. And he had gone out with a couple other, he was, a tax assessor from Montana Territory, horribly nearsighted, not particularly someone you would think of as a frontiersman. But there was this group of civic boosters from Montana, and they were going to go out and explore Yellowstone. And they did so in the summer of 1870. And right around Yellowstone Lake, on the western side, which if you've ever been there, it's really forested and there's this tangle of trees, and they were trying to make their way through it. And Everts, they got in a fight about which way to go forward. And Everts stormed off because he was kind of temporary, and he got lost. And his horse left him, which was a huge problem because when you don't have mobility in a place like as huge as Yellowstone, that can be very dangerous for you. The horse also ran off with his blanket, with most of his supplies, his gun. And so he was really left with almost nothing with him. He had an opera glass and a couple of knives. And when you are lost in a landscape like that, and I think we hear these stories all the time of people getting lost in the wilderness and somehow surviving, right? Or sometimes they don't survive. If they're, mountain climbers and they get caught in an avalanche or whatever, they're going out into the wilderness and they're taking this huge risk. And these places in nature, if you are not prepared as a human to survive those conditions, you probably will not survive. And at this point, there were not many people in Yellowstone. Everts at one point, his greatest fear had been running into indigenous people who would, kill him or take him prisoner. But within a couple of days of being lost, he was actually fervently hoping he would run into them, because that meant that they would,
please, where are you?
Anyone, please. And he ended up being lost in Yellowstone for 37 days until Yellowstone Jack Baronet found him with his dog. He had actually gone to find him because the Everett's friends kind of put a bounty out and said, if you can find this person, we'll pay you. And so he did in fact find him. It took Everett several months to actually recover from that experience because he was skeletal by the time he was found. He, was not able to catch much food for himself without a gun, and was basically subsisting on these thistle roots. And he actually did survive, which is sort of remarkable. But I think Americans like these survival stories, that we have a lot of, if you think about a lot of the documentaries that have come out, like Free Solo, or, these pieces about wilderness adventurers who are taking these big risks and risking their lives to kind of achieve something in nature. And, often they survive, often they do not. And it is a place of great risk. And Yellowstone also, in addition to being kind of hemmed in by all these mountain ranges, it's in a particular location in the United States where you really can only access it completely for 4 months of the year. And so, and part of Everett's problem is that he got lost kind of in September, and the snowstorms come rolling in there at that time of year. And it gets very cold. It's very high. It's about 8,000 feet of elevation. And you can die just of exposure there quite easily. There are always warnings going out, even now, on Yellowstone National Park's Instagram feed. Like, if you're going to come in the park, make sure you have all of these things. Make sure someone knows where you are, because there's not great cell service. And of course, back then there was no way to contact anybody. There was no cell service of any kind. There's no.
They never had any
line.
bars. Yeah.
No bars. He had no whiskey on him, which would have been helpful. But yeah, and even he goes to warm himself near a hot spring. I mean, at least there was that, right? There was actually thermal warmth. But then he falls in and like scalds his hip, and that's just like what, there are so many different dangers in this place. And it's interesting that you should mention that other case from this last fall, because we were actually staying in Jackson Hole and going to Yellowstone from that side. So she was murdered and found in Grand Teton, which is just south of Yellowstone. And we drove by that site multiple times during that exact week. And I
had
remember
a fantasy of this area. I mean, of this property.
Oh, yes.
Of this, yeah.
Oh yeah. And there, I think that is also very strong, that sort of the van life culture, or the outdoorsy life, where especially young, people in their 20s are going out and camping for long periods, or they're taking their car out there and climbing mountains and doing all of these things during the summer season in particular. But it has that same kind of adventuring ethic that we see in a lot of these explorations. I mean, Hayden's team was very interested in getting to know Yellowstone scientifically, but they also were all, or almost all, kind of outdoorsy men who were interested in being out there in the wilderness together.
As one goes through the book, as I went through the book, why am I talking about one? I went through it. It's clear that you took several occasions to stop and take the reader through these beautiful, brief, but beautiful descriptions of the geography. And you're a beautiful writer, by the way. You go through some of the details of the nature in ways that really just seem so fresh and so interesting. Why is that an important device for you as a writer who is telling a political story and at times a difficult story when you think about the lives impacted? Why was that important for you to stop and say, let's think about the nature?
Yeah, well, so I am an environmental historian. I've always been interested in landscapes. And in fact, I came to a love of history through the landscape because when I was growing up, my mother was afraid to fly. And so we took car vacations. And so my dad he has a master's in history, and he loves historical markers and historical sites. So we always used to joke that we needed to get him a bumper sticker that said, "We'll break for historical markers," because we're always careening off the side of the road, to go read those signs.
When I see the sign, I just wave.
Yeah. I am now a careener. I will stop at every marker there is. And so I grew up kind of in the car, driving through the landscape, going to historical sites, looking at maps. I love maps. I'm obsessed with maps. And so very interested in people who make maps, who are part of this survey. And if you look at all of my books, Saving Yellowstone is my fourth book. And the first book was about swamps, the second about ruins, the third about deserts, and this one about Yellowstone. And so they really are connected by my interest in kind of strange landscapes, and landscapes that Americans are drawn to, that they want to do something with. They either want to convert it into something else, or they want to preserve it for their own enjoyment. And they want control of it. They want to fight over it. And so I wanted to give readers a sense of people moving through actual places. And so I wanted to give a sense of, what trees were growing, what flowers were growing, what color was it? What is the color of the rock in, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone? And what is it like to kind of stand there on the verge of that enormous waterfall and watch the river kind of going over the edge?
You've done
and
those
plunging.
things. I mean, some of these moments were autobiographical in this book, even though it's a piece of biography.
Well, interestingly, so I first went to Yellowstone in 1982, so almost 40 years ago, which is crazy. When I was almost 10 years old, on a family trip with my parents and my annoying older brother. And we wore powder jackets. I'm not sure if I think you're younger than me, Evan, so you may not have gone through this phase, but anyone who grew up in the 80s in the West knows about powder jackets. They were ski jackets that had this huge front pocket on them, and they came in two-tone colors. So mine was light blue and dark blue. My brother's was red and black.
I'd like to see a picture of them. I'm
a
little younger than you. I'm born in 83, so I'm a little younger than you.
You're much younger than me.
I don't want to say much.
You're a very young man. You're a very young man. I am a middle-aged lady. So I have these great photos, which I'm going to start posting for the book of that trip to Yellowstone, of us, at all of these places. I started to write this book in the summer of 2019. I had a research trip planned to Yellowstone for May of 2020. That got canceled and moved to September of 2020, which got canceled also. So I actually wrote all of those, the section of the book where Hayden and his team are actually in the Yellowstone. I wrote those sections from my own living room outside Boston, Massachusetts, having not been physically in Yellowstone for almost 40 years. But then we went this past September 21, and went to all of these places in the book. And I was finally able to see them all. And in fact, I had some time. The book was in production, but I had the ability to change some of the details, which I did because I, found out that some of the things were not quite as I had imagined them. But Hayden and his team were so good at giving descriptions. And then we also have, if you Google Yellowstone, and
there's
images, I mean, you can find, there are a few,
yeah.
They're just a few, just a couple.
And
so that helped me to imagine it. But otherwise, I mean, that was a special circumstance. Otherwise, I am very much invested in going to the places that I write about, because I think it's important not only to know that place and understand then the history of it, because there are lots of things the landscape can tell you that documents cannot. But also because I think it's more enjoyable for the reader to be immersed in that place in a really specific way. And for anyone who has been to Yellowstone, hopefully they will recognize those places in my description. And for people who haven't yet been, hopefully it will kind of provoke them to go.
I'm interested. The expedition. What does Hayden find, and what does he bring back to Congress at a time when Congress was apparently still working, still achieving things?
Yes, I know. It's amazing, isn't it? Like they're passing laws. They're actually
and they're actually being
I
signed.
know exactly. So Hayden is out with his large team of scientists and assistants and workers who helped the expedition along from pretty much the end of May until early October. And during that time, they took the Transcontinental Railroad from Omaha to Ogden, Utah. Then they went north and went up and then arced over through Bozeman, and then came down to the north entrance of Yellowstone. By that time, it was sort of midsummer, and they were able to go through most of the park. They saw what is now called Mammoth Hot Springs, which they called the White Mountain. They were the first white Americans to really see and record that feature, which is an astounding place. Definitely a must-see if you are going to Yellowstone. They stayed there for a couple of days. They broke off pieces of the structure. They took water samples. They gathered all kinds of animals and birds and fossils and anything else that they could find. Every couple of days, they would pack those up, send them back, and they would ultimately get put on the eastbound train and sent to the Smithsonian Institution. And by the time they were done, they kind of entered from the north and went counterclockwise in a circle. And so they went, down to Yellowstone Lake, then west across to the geothermal basins, and then kind of back to the lake, and then over and back out the northern entrance over the course of those 2 months, and produced about 45 boxes of specimens large boxes and containers that they shipped back to the Smithsonian to sift through and write about and study a little bit later. Hayden was very interested in just figuring out what was there and how old the basin might be, because the big debate in geology at this time was how old was the Earth and what were its geohistorical kind of epochs. And so everything that he was finding, particularly minerals and fossils, were giving him a sense where he could date the creation of the Yellowstone Basin, and also think about it in terms of the kind of volcanic forces of the Earth's creation. And again, they didn't know about plate tectonics yet. They weren't fully aware of a lot of the kind of scientific forces that we know about now in terms of, continental drift and uplift and all these things. They didn't have that kind of knowledge quite yet. But Hayden was extremely pleased with the way that the expedition turned out. He felt that he had been the first person to really, truly, scientifically discover Yellowstone, even though that term, of course, is volatile. But that he could then use all of these specimens that he brought back from Yellowstone to help show members of Congress what was there. It was also very useful to have along with him William Henry Jackson, who was a photographer, and Thomas Moran, who I mentioned before because Jay Cook helped to fund his trip. Thomas Moran was a landscape painter, and the two of them produced these just really amazing visual images of Yellowstone. And, at that time, photography was relatively new. It was about 20 years old as a technology. And even though now, we know that photographs are highly manipulated, right? I mean, look at anyone's Instagram feed and how manipulated they are. But for many Americans, photographs meant truth and reality. Right. And so when they looked at William Henry Jackson's photographs, they're like, oh, okay, that's proof, right? That's proof that those that Old Faithful actually exists.
So Congress makes a national park. What
Yes.
happens to the indigenous, and what would have happened to Yellowstone if a national park hadn't been made?
So in the debate about the Yellowstone Act, two interesting things happened. This was not a unanimous decision. This is important to remember. I mean, I think we think about it as something that just happened and everyone agreed to, but actually about 89% of Republicans voted for it and 70% of Democrats voted against it. So because Republicans had such a huge majority in Congress at this point, because the former Confederate states had just come back into the Union and most of them had elected Republican representatives. So they had real power. And so they were able to pass the act pretty easily. But there were objections to it. And most of those objections were actually about white land rights. That saving land like this, taking land out of a territory and giving it to the federal government to manage for the people and to preserve and not to use in any way, would infringe upon the rights of white Americans, which they'd had since the Jeffersonian period, to take up land, buy it from the government if they wanted, or just kind of inhabit it through squatters' rights and then purchase it later and farm it or ranch it or do something else with it. So that was the real major objection, and both Democrats and Republicans objected to that. So
it's our right to be able to go somewhere and buy it and do what we want. It's our right to do that.
Yes, that is an enshrined American right. And particularly during this period, people really believed that that was a fundamental American right, and that it could not be taken away. And it was particularly sacrosanct in the American West. And so that was one of the objections. There was one House member, John Taft, I think I'm saying it unless it's Taffy, who asked a question that I think surprised everyone, because he asked if the Yellowstone Act was going to infringe on Lakota land rights. And I think everyone was surprised because at this point in time, white Americans didn't believe that indigenous people had any rights. There had been a treaty made in 1868 with multiple Lakota bands, not all of them, and not Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull did not sign that treaty. But Yellowstone was not included within that territory. So William Dawes, who was a Massachusetts Republican and who would later go on to author the Dawes Act in 1887, which took millions of acres of land away from indigenous people to sell to white Americans, he basically dismissed that concern and said, even if it was part of their territory per a previous treaty, they're not going to use it. And the federal government reserves the right to take it from them anyway, which they did in many of these treaties negotiated in the 1860s. So there was debate about it, but they did pass it. There wasn't much tourist activity really until 1883 when the Northern Pacific finally was completed. Because again, it's really hard to get to. And even now it's kind of hard to get to. You really have to, fly to a comparatively small airport and drive a fairly long distance.
You can't just land on a helicopter in a geyser and walk away. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, you cannot. Yeah. And there are multiple. I know. I mean, I'm sure someone has tried, but
right.
But yeah. So what the Yellowstone Act did is it did preserve this ecosystem, which is one of the most kind of largest intact ecosystems in the world. From this moment in 1872, I mean, they've built a lot of infrastructure in the park. There are hotels, there are roads, but most of that land is not accessible by any visitor, really, unless you're going on a really long backpacking trip, kind of back in there, which would be dangerous because bears and other forms of wildlife. Because bears. I mean, that should really be their tagline for a lot of this.
How do you, just real briefly, I mean, we could go on for hours about this. Grant heroically during this time period goes after the Klan and uses the federal government to try and root them out. How do you explain the desire and the he put his neck on the line to fight for Black rights at that time, but he did not have the same feelings towards the indigenous. How do you explain it? Just real quick. I mean, how do you explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great kind of ironies and contradictions of the Reconstruction period that we also see in the Civil War to some extent, that the Grant administration could fight for racial equality and civil rights for Black Americans in the South and simultaneously use the power of the federal government, that same power of the federal government, to fight and remove indigenous peoples in the West. And this was all a part of the Republican Party's kind of vision of both how to use federal power and then also how land should be used across the country, right? And I think it's important to remember, too, that Grant has a military background. And so one of the reasons that he is so dedicated, at least initially, to this fight against the Klan is that he sees them as resurgent Confederate rebels. And Grant was really at his best at president when he could act like a military general. And so he saw the emergence of white supremacists and the emergence of the KKK in the South. And any kind of, if the federal government allowed that to happen, that would directly refute all that had been lost in the Civil War by his own soldiers, all of that death, all of that destruction, Lincoln's whole vision for the Union, and Grant was a great friend of Lincoln's, and he really admired and respected him and wanted to honor those lives. And to him, the rise of the KKK was another rebellion against the federal government. And so he was really in his almost kind of sweet spot at this moment, because he declared several counties in South Carolina to be in a state of rebellion, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and sent the military in to arrest people, basically establishing martial law. And that is a very militaristic thing to do. He used the same kind of approach in the West, kind of use the power of the U.S. Army to try and control indigenous people, bring them to heel, get them to surrender, and move them onto reservations where they could be, quote unquote, civilized into Americans.
I'm hearing echoes of another of our great nature-oriented presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. He was 13, 14, 15 years old, who had many of the same ideas about American power as Grant did. And I'm making that connection now. Was he watching this as a teenager?
You know, I am not sure if he was fully aware of what was going on in Yellowstone at this moment. He was in the West by the early 1880s and really at that point started to think of himself as a Westerner, started, wearing buckskin and like really kind of advocating for.
He was looking for those bears that
he really was. He wanted to fight bears. He was like, let me fight them, let me shoot them. Let's see what I can do. And, he really invested in the West as something that would not only shore up federal power, but also kind of shore up his own masculinity and the kind of, that whole vision. And
America's masculinity that he wanted.
Exactly. And, I think his approach to conservation was, even more radical, obviously, than Grant's. I mean, Grant was interested in this possibility. He signed the Yellowstone Act with no problem, but he didn't really advocate for it. He didn't really.
It landed on his desk and he took his pen out and signed it.
Yeah, he didn't have any objections to it. He thought it was fine, but he was not a conservationist like Teddy Roosevelt was a conservationist. So in some ways you can excuse a lot of Americans for thinking that Yellowstone is a Teddy Roosevelt project, right? And they really do. There's the Roosevelt Arch at the northern entrance. There's a whole quadrant of the park that is named after Roosevelt. And it's because he came later and really supported efforts to build more infrastructure in the park. And then, of course, had his own really remarkable conservationist presidency. So Grant kind of gets shunted off. He doesn't really get any of the credit for any of this. But the credit really goes to the Republicans in Congress who had funded Hayden's expedition and then were lobbied by him and other people, including Jay Cook, to save this place as a national park for the first time ever.
The sheer
new instrument. Yeah.
The sheer number of parks and other land that Teddy Roosevelt and then his what is it, cousin, his nephew, I remember his cousin, both of them, Teddy and FDR, both enshrined huge tracts of land in our country for us to have forever, which is extraordinary. So what is next for you? I don't know if you're already writing your next book. You were apparently already writing before when we were talking about the last one. So but I'm not sure what's next for you. I don't even know if you want to answer that. You don't have to. But if I said, let's say that your next book can't be about the American West, but it does have to be about an important piece of land that encapsulates our country's story, which would you choose?
Oh my goodness.
So get out of the West.
Well, the next book is about the West. And so I can't, right. I know it's so it's called The Westerners.
Okay.
And it's going to be a kind of bigger, more synthetic book, although it still will be based in the stories of individuals. And what that book is going to do is really kind of push against the pioneer myth that really is still strong in our culture today and in works of history and also in kind of popular culture and the American imagination. The whole idealized vision of the white family moving west in the Calistoga wagon, that The Westerners is going to push against that and give readers a lot of different stories of people moving from south to north, from north to south, from west to east, through the West at all different times, trying to claim it for their own. But that's not going to be out until 2025. So we've got some time. I have not started, I know, I haven't started writing that yet, although I have started researching it, and I can't wait to get back into the archives.
It'll take you 3 years again to do it.
Yes. Yeah. So it'll be a longer process than this one was. Oh my gosh. What?
So if you had to come back east, if you had to write something,
back east.
What piece of land? I mean, I'm thinking of maybe the Everglades. Does that need a book?
Well, I mean, there are actually several good books on the Everglades. And in fact, I began my writing career in the Okefenokee Swamp. That's where the first book is. And so Florida, and Florida is a fascinating place just in general, as I know you will agree.
We have done a podcast called The Old Florida.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It has a fascinating history and it has a fascinating landscape also. And I have actually never been in the Everglades itself. So, I've been to Florida and other places, but
where?
It is a really distinctive place.
So where? What else? Give me another example of a place that tells America's story, a natural location.
Oh my gosh. I am going to need more time to think about.
You can come back next. You can come back next year. Although you have to wait 3 years now for you to come back. You're not holding up your one book a year promise.
I know. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let me read one more quote and we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Yellowstone promised to be a place that proved America's greatness by virtue of its natural wonders, but its geysers and mud pots revealed the reality of this strange country. The U.S. is both beautiful and terrible. It's both fragile and powerful, and what lies beneath the surface is always threatening to explode. And suddenly, as I read that quote, and I thought about the mural that you describe at the U.S. Capitol building, I thought about January 6th. Do you know if that mural was desecrated in any way during that uprising?
I don't think that it was. I was really worried about that, actually. And Moran's painting was safely in the Department of the Interior, so that was not going to be a problem. But yeah, the Westward, the Course of Empire Makes Its Way, which is a mural by Emanuel Leutze that was installed in the Capitol during the Civil War, is still there. And I believe it is okay. It was not defaced, which thank goodness. And I was very surprised. I was writing about the rotunda and about Hayden going to Congress and about the exhibit that he was creating for the rotunda to lobby for the act during the insurrection, at that moment. And it was a powerful moment for me. I was really surprised by my reaction, that to see all those people coursing through that area with zero respect for its history and its artworks, I just was enraged. So I think we're just very lucky that there wasn't more destruction of those kind of artistic features or the architectural features of that space, as they were, busy destroying democracy.
Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, the author of Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Check out her books and her website, which is megankatenelson.com. She's on Twitter at Megan Kate Nelson. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.